Bienvenue, welcome once again to another podcast. This specific podcast called Construction Matters tends to be about all topics to do within the construction industry. And today is no different. And we have, as usual, Hamish McClay of Search Convey, our Lord and Master, but and of course, the incredible, incomparable Michelle Carr of the Construction Alchemy Limited, the guardian angel of the construction contractor. Today, we're talking about something which is fundamental to the way in which the construction industry runs, but sometimes derided by a few. Why the Construction Act still matters. But to start us off, Hamish McClay.
Oh, interesting thing, actually. Anybody under 30 probably doesn't remember life without the internet.
Yes, actually.
Now,
and the funny thing about this is, Hamish, I was only speaking to Kirsty the other day. I said, if we didn't have the internet, would we even be able to function? There's a thought.
Oh, so now the other interesting thing is, with the very youthful Michelle here, she probably doesn't remember life without the Construction Act.
Oh. Do you remember? I mean, hang on, this is a question for Michelle. When did the Construction Act actually come in, Michelle?
1996.
And you were, sorry, I'm not going to be indelicate. Do you remember? No,
I remember the construction industry before that, which is why when I speak about it, I say, as far as I'm aware, the main thing of the Construction Act was bringing in the adjudication alternative dispute resolution, but I don't actually know that for fact because I was working in the industry, but unofficially at that time.
Well, let me pop back to Hamish. Continue your monologue, sir. Sorry to interrupt you.
Well, it more or less sort of ended it, really, because this particular sort of act, funny enough, I thought it was 1986. So I'd actually sort of got it wrong, but 1996, it's still 30 years ago. And it must be, though, that something that is important as that, which is still as effective. I'm not so sure whether it's been through any amendments and sort of all the rest of it, because we've had so many other things amended. But the fact that Michelle relies upon that and the content of that for aspects which are still continuing does obviously mean it still carries with it a great deal of usefulness.
All right. No, okay. Back to you, Michelle. Now, as usual, and this goes for all my communication with Michelle, pretending that I'm an slightly educated moron, why is the Construction Act relevant at all? Can't people just get on with it without having an act behind them?
So the Construction Act is actually called the Housings and Regeneration Act. So it's a very big act. It talks about procurement, talks about government contracts, it talks about payment terms. But the main thing that the construction that I deal with is bringing in JCT contracts and joint contract tribunal, which basically everyone's heard of JCT. There's a suite of contracts, and there's anything from the homeowner's contract to private contracts, D&B contracts, intermediate, major works, minor works. There's even a modular one now. And the key thing about the Construction Act for me was the fact pre-Construction Act, the only way of dealing with a dispute was litigation or arbitration, which is a lengthy process. So if a contractor fell out with a subcontractor, or a subcontractor wanted to get paid from a main contractor, or a main contractor wanted to get paid from a client, the only way of doing that would have been going through arbitration, which is a lengthy and very expensive process. And basically people could just say, no, I'm not paying you. And that was that. So the main thing was an alternative dispute resolution. So you've got mediation, which is being brought in. In fact, a lot of courts are expecting disputes to go through mediation first. And mediation is obviously the first stage of having a conversation around a table with a mediator or without a mediator, trying to come to some sort of an agreement. But the key thing was the introduction of adjudication. And adjudication is known as rough justice because it's a very quick process. But generally, it's a process where it's a 28-day period and you get a decision that's enforceable within 28 days.
And if you go through that process, does that mean the wrong decision is reached?
No. So basically, because it's so quick and they call it rough justice, there is protocol that you have to adhere to for it to be valid. So a dispute has to crystallize. So there has to be a dispute, not just the fact that somebody feels like adjudication. There has to be a dispute. And then you have to do a pre-action protocol letter, and there's a certain way of doing things, and you need to get an adjudicator. Then you have to basically put your case to the adjudicator why you believe there is adjudication, that they have a jurisdiction, stipulate what their jurisdiction is and what it is you want them to look at. You have to be very specific when you're adjudicating, because you have to give the adjudicator the power that you need. And if you don't include every aspect of it, so for example, the adjudication could be that you demand a payment from a particular payment certificate, but unless you give the adjudicator the power to say, we believe we're owed 100,000 or your valuation of our application, if you don't do that last bit, if you say we're due £1,000 and the adjudicator doesn't agree it's £1,000, they believe it's £999, 900 or whatever it may be, or it might have been £1,001 or £100,001, whatever it may be. If it's different, the amount that you speculate in the adjudication, you don't give them the authority to value it themselves, then it's a yes or no case. So you'll lose the adjudication for that amount of money, but you don't, even though you're entitled to a different sum of money. So you've got to be very, very specific. But then, so you have 7 days to issue your facts, what it is, your case, and then the opposition party has 7 days to issue their case, and then the adjudicator has 14 days. Now, if this is a case where, and theoretically, you could deliver an entire truckload of evidence to an adjudicator and they've still got 14 days to assess it. They can ask for an extension, doesn't have to be granted. So it's a very quick process that they've got 14 days. Now, if it's just a couple of A4 pages and it's very simple, it's quite easy to go through. But if you've got boxes and boxes and boxes of information because this dispute is about a contract or a final account that's been going on for 3 years or something like that, then it's very, very difficult for the adjudicators are limited. You've also got the low value adjudication, which is a fairly new introduction, where there is a cap on the adjudicator's fee. So I think it's about 3,500, 4,000, something like that, which means they have even less time to have a look at it. But that's generally for things of low value, or is most of it, most recently that I've seen, is because somebody hasn't issued a pay less notice.
So how do you determine whether a contract qualifies as a construction contract?
So by law, if you haven't got a written contract, you're covered by the Construction Act unless you're working on your own house. The only time that you're exempt in this country is if you're working on your own property, which is why I always recommend people working on their own property to have a JCT contract. So there are certain terms that are standard. Most of them are covered in a standard JCT anyway. So there are terms where you are covered. You are entitled to adjudication, etc. But it gets a little bit sloppy, and obviously it's a bit more difficult to prove. You don't have any of the specifics like a program or the contract terms or an agreed schedule of works or a contract sum analysis or something like that, but you are covered as standard just because you're working in the UK. There are criteria, but majority of the projects are covered.
I read recently that some contracts had these weird clauses, pay when paid.
It's illegal.
Yeah. How do you deal with that?
So there is no legal standpoint of paying someone you're paid, and it happens all the time in construction. And I mean, I've had it loads of times where we haven't been paid as a client. Not my problem. Okay, I try to be lenient with my clients because it's not necessarily conducive to a good working relationship. But you cannot not pay someone just because they haven't been paid. And I've had this argument many thousands of times with people. Just because we haven't been paid doesn't mean that you can't be paid. The difference is if we haven't been paid because we can't substantiate. So say, for example, I'm working for a developer, I'm working for a main contractor, and a subcontractor cannot substantiate their claim, then I've got no chance of substantiating the claim either if it's a variation. So if somebody can't substantiate their claim, that's different. And if there is a variation and they haven't substantiated that variation, which also, if I'm the main contractor or the developer, then I need to get that from the client, whoever that may be. Right. So if there's a variation that isn't substantiated, if I can't substantiate it either, then I'm not going to get paid for it, and my subcontractor can't get paid with it, which is why I always support subcontractors in making sure their variation accounts are absolutely concrete, and because the onus is on the person claiming the money to prove that they're owed it. But other than that, the whole pay that I don't know, I've never seen it before. It's possible that people might put that in a contract. People do change the payment terms. It should be 28-day valuations and 14-day payments after that, and it does get a little bit complicated, but the way that the contract writes it in the JCT, but it shouldn't be allowed. Not a valid piece of not
Forgive
paying.
me, I've done a little bit of research. I just want to ask some silly questions, if you don't mind. What's your advice for handling interim valuations when the contract wording doesn't fully align with the Act?
So if the contract wording doesn't align with the Act, it doesn't matter if you signed the contract, or even if you haven't signed the contract, they've sent the contract, and then by action, by turning up on site or carrying out the work, you've agreed to those terms. If it's different to the Construction Act, then you have to abide by the contract.
So the contract is the king here? Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
If there is no contract, then you've got the Construction Act to fall back on, but ultimately you want to have a contract because the Construction Act is obviously quite broad in general.
Okay, here's a hard one. When would you recommend using the Act's recommended adjudication process versus negotiation or mediation?
So I would always recommend in making sure that dispute resolution is discussed and agreed in the contract stage, at pre-contract stage, and the method that you want to use is within the contract. So within the contract, there is an adjudication clause or arbitration clause. I tend to remove arbitration clauses unless it's a really big, as in 10, 50, 60, 70, 100 million pound contract, then yes, arbitration needs to stay in there, because you need to have that finite for that size project, because it's not going to be simple. For smaller projects, I always allowed adjudication, and you either specify the adjudication if you want to, if you know one that you've used before, or you can specify that the law states of how adjudication works. So I've never seen, I'm not saying it hasn't happened, I've never seen an adjudication clause change the terms. The protocol is a protocol, the process is the same, and right. I've never seen a contract change that.
All right. For you, as a QS, what are the biggest compliance risks clients still overlook?
Client risks?
Compliance risks.
Oh, compliance. So the main issue with compliance is fire. It's very, very tough out there. It's very difficult to get fire regulations, building control sign off, ESW1s if you've got cladding. The fact that you've got FRA sign off, that is the biggest compliance issue at the moment, because 1 millimeter difference on the edge around the door is a difference between somebody lives or dies. And I have this argument with sites all the time. It's only 1 mil, it's only 1 mil, it's only 1 mil, because we're in the construction industry, we're used to tolerances of much greater than that. But then I have to have the same conversation. And I've had this conversation actually last week with a guy, and it's the 5th or 6th time I've had this conversation with the same guy. The difference is if the gap is 1 mil bigger than it's supposed to be, the smoke will get in, and by the time the fire brigade get here, that person will be dead. If you take that mil off and reduce that gap by 1 mil, by the time the fire brigade get here, they will still be alive. That's the difference.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to adjudicate when you're talking about lives, isn't it? Because it's like
that wouldn't go to adjudication. So if there was a fire, that's going to be way part. I mean, adjudication's only relevant throughout the construction contract.
Right.
So if you didn't get an maybe you might go to adjudication because the terms of the contract stated that the contractor needed to get the FRA sign off, and if the sign off hasn't been given by the FRA due to incompetence, but then it depends on what was specified in the contract and the design criteria in the first place. So it's complicated. You could potentially adjudicate something like that. But that wouldn't happen when somebody had died, because at that point, nobody would be occupying the premises. The only way that if somebody did die, that would be obviously a court case tribunal. That would be something much greater that I don't have any experience in, but that would be dealt with by solicitors. And that's obviously a huge thing, because you've got corporate manslaughter on the line, which is
That-
why,
that-
as a contractor,
I've got a couple more. I've got a couple more questions, and I'm going to toss the caber as it were back to Hamish. This is one that you and I have discussed before, but not publicly. So I want to ask you: if a subcontractor hasn't been paid and no pay less notice was issued, what rights do they have under the Act?
First of all, they have a right to adjudicate. So if they've issued their application for payment in terms of their contract, and the due date has passed and there's no payment certificate, and the 7 days or whatever is stated in the contract before the payment date has passed, and they haven't been issued a pay less notice, and they haven't been paid on the payment due date rather than the due date, the actual payment date, then they can issue a adjudication, and it's pretty cut and shut case. If the contractor or the client or whoever it is you're doing the application for payment for has not issued you with a pay less notice as per the contract, then the adjudication is very, very clear, and it will go in favour of the party that is doing the application. Because if you don't review it, you haven't certified it, you are entitled to pay exactly what they've applied for by default. And if you don't, obviously you can get adjudicated, and that's very, very simple.
All right. Okay, and one last one on this notice, because I know people watching are going to. This is the sort of thing that they have no real knowledge about. So that's
but they can also pull off site. They can issue a 7-day letter saying without payment we're going to pull off site. There are other things you have to obviously. As I said, there is a protocol that you need to do. You have to issue a pre-action protocol letter. You have to issue a letter saying we're going to adjudicate if we don't get paid. You can issue a 7-day letter saying we're pulling off site. You can pull off site if they haven't paid. You are then entitled to basically the cost to decamp the site, and then obviously put all your staff and whatever it is you've got, whether you've got materials or business, whatever it may be you've got on site, you can do all of that. And it is a bit of a difficult process, but you're entitled to a cost associated with that.
I've got one last question on this topic before I pass back to Hamish. If, and I know this happens, a main contractor issues a payment notice but it's late, how would you handle that situation? Well,
it depends on how late it is. So it depends whether it is a payment notice or a pay less notice and when it falls. If, for example, there is I would say to my clients, if they've issued a payment notice and say it's after the due date, but then they're prepared to pay it, and actually it's there or thereabouts, or it's a reasonable payment, I would accept it. And if it's because, which is often the case, the subcontractor hasn't substantiated what they're applying for, or they haven't necessarily applied properly, then I will always say to them, look, take the money and just make sure you give them the information. But if it's something that's happening regularly, obviously you have to take a different stance. I wouldn't recommend going to adjudication for no reason, because if you can get paid, it's a lot quicker to just get that payment. And even if it is slightly less than you're applying for, you getting it then and there rather than waiting for at least 5 weeks, because you've got to get your stuff together to do your adjudication, find whoever's going to do who's going to do the adjudication for you, prepare it, etc., etc. You're looking at 5 or 6 weeks before you're going to get paid. I'd always encourage getting a payment in, even if it's a couple of days late, but potentially writing a strong letter to say this is late and this won't be tolerated again, and so on and so forth.
Okay, well, sorry about that. I've done a bit of homework beforehand. I hope you don't mind. And Hamish, have you got any last thoughts before you wind us up for today?
Well, not really. It was one of those things, and Michelle could probably answer this anyway. We have so many interim acts and things being put in. We seem to have this knee-jerk reaction at the moment that we've got to do something. We've got to produce this Act of Parliament. We've got to produce, the bill needs to be, we've been speaking about, let's do something. And we end up sort of having to sort the mess out. Now, it sort of strikes me, listening to the sort of conversation, that this particular sort of bill, which was turned into an act, seems to have been sufficiently comprehensive. Does it still need any amendment, Michelle? Or we still, even though we're looking at something which is very close to, it was obviously talked about 30 years ago, before it became an act, does that need updating at all? Or we sort of pretty well clear on, have we got it right?
Well, the Procurement Act was issued last year, I think, which updates some of it, but that's more to do with equal bidding and government contracts and that kind of thing, which opens the forum up. So that has been sort of revised of that part of the Construction Act. The other part of it, not necessarily, but it has developed by judicial precedent. So there are a lot of cases that have happened where, for example, you can adjudicate on an interim payment and then re-adjudicate on a final account. And there's bits and pieces that have happened. There's a lot of judicial precedent. Now, I don't actually prepare adjudications because I'm not in the knowledge and I'm not getting involved in what's happening and the judicial precedent side of it. So I would always I've got people I work with. I can prepare the contractor's case on advice from a specialist. I'm a member of the CIARB, but I don't actually, I can advise on how to get the information together and what their case is. I just don't produce it because I'm not aware of the case law. So that's how it's sort of carried on being relevant and working since 1996. And obviously, I suppose increasing, or it's the best way of putting it. It's been, improving, sorry, not increasing. It's been improving since 1996 through the cases.
If someone wanted to get in touch with you to discuss this or other topics still further, where would be the best place they could go?
My website, which is constructionalchemy.co.uk, or find me on LinkedIn.
Perfect. Hamish, would you take us home, please?
Well, I think, as always, is the case, Michelle, if you want clarification, she's the sort of person to speak to because that clarification is there. But the other aspect is as well, which Michelle is so very good. If she doesn't have the knowledge, which she just explained just now, there are people she will know who can be working on your behalf. But it's good to see something that is actually working. It was an act, it was a bill, became an act, it's actually sort of working, and you won't have people fighting over it. And there does appear to be sensible resolution.
Yeah.
Hang on a moment.
There's nothing wrong with the act.
Yeah.
The problem in the construction industry is not, I mean, the whole idea of the act, as far as I'm concerned, my interpretation was to primarily support subcontractors because they are the ones that struggle the most. However, subby bashing, as it's known, is still happening. The issue with the act is there are not enough business owners that understand it and are able to administer contracts and actually use the act to their advantage. That is the issue. There is a lack of education within the industry of how to use it to your advantage, what it actually means for individuals and how they go about it. The amount of contractors that I know that if they're not being paid, they call a debt collector, which is never the right way to go because there are mechanisms with the contract to get paid that will not make you lose a percentage of what you're owed and also wait for the debt collectors to do their thing. I mean, each their own. That is the main issue, which is why I try to do talks and share things and do speeches and events and explain to people what the Construction Act is and what there is a better way. There's nothing wrong with the Act itself. It's just most business owners aren't educated in the Act. I mean, it took me 10 years to get my head around a JCT and I've been in the industry over 25 years. So it's not that's the issue. It's education that's the problem.
As ever, education, Hamish.
Oh, and very, very much it's the people who are involved that cause the situation to be less than straightforward. Just listen to an expert, and that's the important thing. Just make sure you're speaking to a professional.
Exactly.
And as ever, we banging the drum as ever, Hamish and Michelle, for surrounding yourself with the right people. As Michelle said there, she has certain specialisms. Anything that's outside that, she makes sure she has the right proper personnel that she can then ask questions of to make sure that whatever information and advice she gives out is on the money. Well, I hope you all found that as useful as I did. And hopefully there'll be more to come. Thank you so much, as ever, Michelle Carr from Construction Alchemy Limited. Hamish McClay, our Lord Master, thank you for helping set this up in the first place. And to you out there, keep your feet on the ground. Keep reaching for the stars and look after that mental health. Until next week, goodbye.